Welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to have all of you join us today. My name is Joanna Salinas. I am the Outreach Coordinator with the Waukesha County Green Team. For those of you not familiar with the Waukesha County Green Team, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We are located here in Waukesha County. And our goal is to promote sustainability throughout the county, and we do that by working with residents, municipalities, school districts, organizations, and we work on topics of waste, water, land use, energy, and so we are happy to have all of you with us today. With me also today is Deborah Schneider. Deborah is the president of the Waukesha County Green Team, and Deborah will be monitoring the chat and feeding us questions as they come up. So I just wanted to share my screen. I'm only going to give you a little 30-second kind of overview of how we got here today. So if you were to go to the WaukeshaCountyGreenTeam.org website, you would see that we are really excited this year to launch a guide for municipal sustainability. And within this guide, it's a tool really to assist municipalities and communities with incorporating some actionable elements of sustainability into your ongoing processes. And also any municipal business planning that's happening. So the goal of this guide is really to help you measurably move forward with sustainability within your community. So if you were to scroll down a little bit, there are all sorts of topics in here. These topics include best practices, there's case studies, there's tools in all sorts of sustainability topics. And also within our new municipal project, we are going to be hosting monthly trainings such as these as really a way to bring municipal officials together around topics that maybe we want to learn some more about. You all are doing such incredible work within your communities, and we really want to help promote different projects and ideas around sustainability that really helps uplift the amazing communities in which we live, but also that are very fiscally responsible for our taxpayers. We have a lot of municipal officials with us today. Thank you all for joining us, but we also have some wonderful community members joining us, as well as it looked like from the registration that we even have some great companies who are working in the area. Next month, instead of us hosting a training, we are really promoting the Wisconsin Saltwise Week that's happening in the middle of January. If you're not familiar, there are daily live streams that will happen on a number of topics all around municipal salt use. So it includes salt pollution trends that are happening in our lakes and rivers. And I won't read all these for you, but we will send this out afterwards in case any of you are interested in joining any of these live streams that are happening in January. All right, so without any further ado, we are really excited to have Julia Robson here with us today. Julia has been the Waukesha County Conservation Biologist for the last 5 years. I just heard going on 6 years. And we are really excited to have you share your knowledge around native plantings for municipal parks and green spaces. So welcome, Julia.
Hi, thank you for having me. Okay, I'm going to jump right into it then and share my screen. So thanks again for having me, and thank you everybody for joining this afternoon over your lunch break. Assuming, Joanna, I got thumbs up on my screen. We're good? Okay.
Yep, you look great.
All right. So I'm gonna dive right in here, and I'll just start by saying this is obviously a pretty broad topic. There's a lot that goes into the process revolving around installation of native plantings. It's something that we've done a lot of in Waukesha County Parks. So this will be really a high level overview of those steps within that process. And As Joanna mentioned, my contact information will be shared, so I do encourage you, put some questions in the chat, but then also feel free absolutely to reach out after the program with any additional questions or need for clarification on anything that I cover this afternoon. So as I mentioned, we do quite a bit with native landscaping and Waukesha County Parks. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who we are so you have a better idea, especially if you're a municipality, about what our capacity is to be doing this type of work. We are an 8,500 acre park system. We've got 2 golf courses and Retzer Nature Center. Of those 8,500 acres, a large portion of that acreage falls within our 9 core parks or regional parks. These are our fee-based parks with infrastructure such as roads and parking areas, picnic pavilions and such. Staffing wise, we've got 19 full-time field staff between myself and park foremen and park maintenance workers that are assigned to do most of our native landscaping and native landscaping maintenance. That balloons up to about 250 when we get our seasonal workforce on staff throughout the growing season. So we do have quite the labor force that we're able to utilize in order to kind of get this type of work done. We also manage 42 miles of paved recreational trails. We're a natural resource-based park system. So what that essentially means is for those core parks or our regional parks, the vision is that we maintain those as 70% natural area and then leave a 30% portion of that acreage available to potential developments for, say, recreational activities or other infrastructural projects, picnic areas, lodges, rental facilities, so on and so forth. So the bulk of what we do is managing natural areas. Our natural land management program is pretty robust. We do about 1,000 acres of natural land management per year. So that is everything from prescribed burning to invasive species control, tree plantings, installation of native prairie, so on and so forth. Our annual operating budget is about 1.5 million and just over 77,000 of that is budgeted towards landscaping materials and projects. So if we wanted to do a native installation, the seed would come out of that portion of the budget each year. So now you have a better idea, hopefully, of the type of capacity that we have to be doing projects like this. In addition to managing our natural areas within the park system, we also have, a growing and not mowing program that was initiated in 2008. The objective of this particular program was to look for areas in our parks that were currently mowed turf that were underutilized, or say they were inaccessible or kind of a more of a nuisance, areas that stayed too wet throughout the year and you could barely get in there to mow. So we identified areas within our facilities like that and looked to convert them to native landscaping or native prairies. To date, we have about 102 acres that have been converted to these no-mow areas and installed as native plantings. We still actively mow about 230 acres in our parks. That doesn't include golf courses. Obviously, the mowing regimen in our golf courses is much more extensive, but there's about 245 additional acres within our golf courses that are actively maintained as well. This is just a quick example of what some of those areas looked like that we identified for the growing, not mowing program and to convert to native plantings. Some low-hanging fruit areas like this where most of our parks, our foremen are utilizing out fronts or ZTRs to do the mowing, but for narrow medians like this, they were needing to pull out the walk-behind mower. So inconvenient areas that were mowed turf made for great installation spots for native plantings. Or sites like this at Fox River Park in our playground area, super sloped. Wouldn't want to be mowing on a slope like that, so it was another opportunity for utilizing native landscaping. And then there's sites like this, just a downspout from one of our restroom facility buildings, creating kind of a wet, low area and some turf. It was an ideal spot for a native rain garden. Some of the benefits that we've definitely realized, they range from financial to operational benefits and looking for opportunities to do work like this. Obviously, we did monitor our reduction in fuel consumption by removing this acreage, that 102 acres out of a mowing operation. This would vary for any organization depending on what your equipment is that you're using to mow and how frequently you're obviously mowing within a growing season based on rain, so on and so forth. But we estimate that annually we're saving just over 5,000 gallons of fuel each year by not mowing those acres that we have now converted to native prairie installations. Obviously, there's an associated reduction in staff time with that level of mowing being reduced as well. And then for more formalized landscaping beds, we're obviously not needing to water them as much, so reduced water consumption is also another realized benefit. And then we also have the environmental benefits too that come with that. So by installing these native habitats within our green spaces, we're improving habitat for local wildlife, obviously improving carbon storage, sequestration and storage too. It's estimated that an acre of prairie can store about a ton of carbon versus turf grass, you're looking at about half of that. Increased biodiversity as well. A lot of these native plantings aim to contain a diverse array of forbs and grasses. I think if there's anything we've seen on the municipal level that helps to support the case of increasing biodiversity and how it supports resilience in our community green spaces is what we saw happen with ash and emerald ash borer. So when we have just a couple species or a single species within our green spaces, they're much more at risk when pathogens or pests come through or environmental disasters occur. Or stressors occur. So the more diverse a system is that we can have in our green spaces, the more resilient it will be long-term. And then also at the end of the day, these native plantings can really, if done well and maintained properly, they do increase the green space appeal. They're aesthetically pleasing to look at, and it's a beautiful addition to your park if you can look for appropriate spots to do something like this in. The pictures definitely make it look like kind of a cut and paste process. You start with some overgrown, maybe bluegrass on the left there. You kill off the sod, you remove it, you plant some seeds, and then you get a beautiful prairie. It's definitely feasible, it's doable, but there are a lot of steps to the process and really important steps that have to be taken to get from point A to point B successfully. So that's basically the goal of the presentation, is to cover what those steps are and some of the considerations that you really need to be taking into account when you're looking to do this in some of your green spaces. So first off is site selection. If you are looking to do this, where do you start? What are the considerations you should be making? So what we've done in our parks is we've identified areas of underutilized turf grass, as I mentioned. And when we're looking to do a conversion to native plantings, one of the things we're considering are access, not just the access to that spot for installing the planting, but also for maintenance. Are you going to need to water it? If it's a dry year, you're going to need to do some maintenance mowing, which we'll talk about later in the presentation, but access is really important. So you want to make sure that the site's accessible for you and for your staff to maintain and install it. Sunlight is another consideration. Obviously, some areas may be shadier. There are plantings you can do that are specified with species that can handle shadier spots, but most of these plantings in these areas that I'll be referring to today are sunnier, more open grown areas of turf. So prairie plants, they've evolved to receive at least a half day to a full day of sun. And full sun is best, especially if you're working in areas that are heavy clay or kind of wet areas that you're looking to convert into a native planting. So the amount of sunlight the spot gets is something you should note before picking it. Slope and aspect. So if you've got kind of hilly terrain or a sloped area near maybe a drainage basin or something, you want to take that into account too, because that'll affect how much sunlight something's getting. South and westerly facing slopes will be warmer, they'll be sunnier and drier. And also slope will affect whether or not maybe you'll need some erosion control measures that you'll have to put in place. You might need to put down a cover crop when you do a seeding, or consider something like a hydro seeding. We won't go too in depth into that, but just know you should be considering the slope and the aspect of slope in areas that you're looking to do this. The next couple are really important too. Surface area to edge ratio. So often when we're looking for areas to convert from turf to native plantings, we tend to avoid picking areas that are really long and narrow. Weeds and things like invasive species, they really tend to be exacerbated when you have more edge than you do surface area to a planting. Those weed species and invasive species really do well on something that we call the edge effect. So there's a sharp resource gradient on edges of areas, of natural areas and plantings, and that's where the weeds really tend to hone in. So you want to have a good surface area to edge ratio. It's not obviously a completely eliminating factor, but it's something you need to consider in terms of maintenance. You might be doing a lot more of it with weeds if you have a really long, narrow area that you're considering doing this in. And then existing weed densities. I've starred this one because often we get budget to do something and then we got to go and get it done and in the ground, but there really should be some time spent on the front end, maybe going out to some of your grounds and facilities and looking at, what does the landscape look like, looking for opportunities to do work like this, but then assessing, okay, if I'm going to take this turf grass out and plant a prairie here, what are some of the weed issues nearby? Because, these plants, they don't know these boundary lines, and Canada thistle will pop up wherever it can readily. So you want to avoid areas with really well-established perennial weeds already in them in terms of doing conversions. And if you're going to do one, you want to make sure that you're ahead of the game by doing control in those areas before attempting to do some sort of installation. So lastly, there I have sites that I find to be the most ideal for doing something like this. They are existing right now as mowed and managed or maintained turf grass. Because you're already mowing it, you're not likely having seed set of other perennial weeds in those areas. Things like cornfields or soybean fields that are coming out of production, where you kind of have an open, basically soil base to plant onto, or open soil sites from recent construction can also be kind of ideal mediums to start with, versus trying to go in and work with something that's already overgrown or considered old field. When you have your site picked out, the next thing is thinking about what your goals are with that. So is your goal strictly just function? I have a really wet spot of turf grass here, and I just want to put some plants in there that are going to help soak this up and basically serve as a sponge there. Or is it more than function? Are you looking to improve the curb appeal? Do you want really showy, bright wildflowers throughout the year? And I want to improve the other environmental benefits that we kind of talked about before earlier in the presentation, because that'll affect how much preparation work you do and also the amount of budget that you need to allocate towards something like this. And that ties into the next thing. What are your available resources? So budget's obviously a factor here. Depending on the budget that you have to work with, that'll affect, what type of seeding or planting you're going to go with, which we'll talk about later. Labor and the skill sets of your labor in terms of doing maintenance, being able to identify perennial weeds or problem weeds that show up and knowing what to do when they are encountered within a planting. And then understanding that this is ultimately not a no maintenance practice. Native plantings, while in the long term have a maintenance savings that kind of accrue, they're not going to be as much mowing or maintenance as turf grass necessarily. There is maintenance that is required in order for them to be maintained as a prairie. These ecosystems or these types of plant communities are always going through succession, is what we call it. So if you just put a prairie in and you walk away, it's going to grow up with woody vegetation and it's going to try to transition towards forest. So we need to do things to maintain it as prairie, involving mowing, potentially burning. I'll talk more about this later, but the point is that it's not no maintenance, but it is lower maintenance over the lifetime of the planting than, say, a turf grass installation is. So the steps involved, you have your site selected, you know what your goals are for it. Your first step is going to be site preparation. And this is often, even in my professional experience, if I've had a project that's gone wrong, it's always because this portion of the process is not done thoroughly enough, or the time is not taken to do it at all. And I've seen that happen too. So your site preparation is going to depend on the size of your planting and some of those other factors that I touched on during the site selection phase. But there's many methods to preparing an area to go from being turf grass to, say, a native prairie planting. For smaller scale sites, like maybe at the downspout spot that I showed you at Fox River Park next to that building, you can smother turf grass on a small scale to kill it, whether it's with thick fabric or cardboard covered by mulching material, as you can see in that image there. Physical sod, removal of the sod, is also a viable option for a small scale site. Now, as we get into larger areas, which is typically the size of the projects that we're installing in the parks, often you're looking at an herbicide treatment to kill off the existing turf to kind of start over, basically. Depending on the site, there may be some form of tillage that could be involved. I'll touch on that in a bit. And then interseeding. So that's basically an enhancement. Maybe you have an area that is, already kind of an old field or overgrown bluegrass area, and you just want to put some wildflower seed in there to spruce it up and get a pop of color and benefits for some pollinators. That's an option too, we'll also talk about in a second. But ultimately it comes down to, what are you starting with? Are you starting with mowed turf? Are you starting with something that's been allowed to go unmanaged for a couple of years? Or are you starting with bare soil? And that will ultimately influence what method that you're going to use. And we're going to touch on that a little further now. So for most of the conversion practices and areas that we have done in our parks, we are starting from turf grass, currently managed turf grass. So you see that in the image in the upper left there. That's actually at the entrance at Waukesha County Park. And so often this is an ideal setting for us to start with. We'll do an application of glyphosate. We're going to kill off the existing turf. We'll do 2 applications of that. Ideally, we try to do one the fall before, so September, towards that end of the growing season the year before, and then again the following spring in late May. So that'll help to kill off any of the cooler season weeds that may be coming up the following year that we didn't really target with the application in fall. If we know that broadleaf weeds are present and kind of persistent in that area, you can also do an application of a broadleaf herbicide in addition to doing a glyphosate application. There's no wrong in doing that to kind of have an added level of effect. But the main thing with any of these is that the thatch needs to be removed prior to seeding. So that dead material that you're creating from doing the herbicide application, it needs to come off, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do with this seed is get it into the ground, right? So that it germinates and it grows. And in order for it to do that, it's going to need that contact with mineral soil, and it's also going to need warmth and sunlight. And so when you have a really thick layer of thatch or dead material, the seed contact to that mineral soil isn't going to be good. And even if it does get down to the soil, is it going to get enough sunlight to be able to germinate and then compete with the other maybe weeds or other things in the planting that are growing with it? So it's important that thatch is removed prior to seeding. What we'll often do is we'll either burn off the thatch if we can, or we've had smaller sites where we've even had volunteers that dead thatch gets mowed down as low as possible and volunteers have raked it off. So that's really only efficient if you have a smaller area. And then often we'll come through and we'll rough up that area with a spiked tooth harrow or something, just to basically expose a little bit of that mineral soil so that the seed can have good contact with it. A note here, though, is that it's important to wait at least 2 weeks after that spring application to plant. So you don't want to go in right after you do that May application on the turf to then go plant native seed or native plugs into it. You want to give it at least a 2-week window before you're going in and doing something like that. So tillage. Tillage is a heavier duty method of basically working the ground. I've got a couple sites that we've had to go in and kind of till up the soil. This is not a technique that I would highly recommend. It's a tool in the toolbox, but there's some pros and cons to working with this. So if you have an area, a site that you've picked that you know you want to work into a native planting, but it's got really compacted soils or it's got really heavy residue on top. So maybe it's a really, really thick layer of Kentucky bluegrass thatch because that area has been allowed to go unmanaged for a long time. That's in this image here that was in the example at the entrance of Neshota Park, where basically the area was sprayed several times and then the material, that thatch, was then tilled into the upper layer of the soil a bit. But there was no way for us to rake off or get rid of the thatch. So this was an option to work that residue back into the soil there. With tillage, the big consideration to keep in mind is that you don't want to go too deep. You don't want to go typically more than 2 inches deep. If you think about what you're doing to the soil there, you're breaking it up and you are bringing and exposing the weed bed, the seed bed that's there in the soil to the surface. So often if you're going to employ some sort of tillage, you want to basically do it intensively throughout for a few weeks up to several years sometimes to exhaust that seed bank, or do it in hand with the site gets tilled and then it gets sprayed. You allow whatever you tilled up to germinate and grow, and then it's sprayed off, and then that material is killed off, and then you repeat that process throughout a growing season. As I mentioned, this is not my preferred method. If you could start with an area that is just mowed turf grass, spray it off, get that thatch off and plant into that. That's kind of an ideal medium. With the tilling sites that we've done this at, the weeds really do, it creates kind of a weed persistence problem. So site preparation needs to be prolonged, in my opinion, on sites like this if you're doing any sort of working to the soil. And it's not the best thing for the soil to be doing this as well. But for some sites, you might not have existing mowed turf to work with. This is an option to prepare those areas that may be compacted or have heavy residue on them for an eventual seeding. But it goes hand in hand with tillage and herbicide application in order to exhaust that weed bed. For interseeding, so this is something that I mentioned that's more of an enhancement. So these are some pictures from Manuka Park. These are areas of turf that staff had stopped mowing it. So the bluegrass kind of grew up. We don't have many weeds except for the sweet clover that I'm seeing in the picture in the bottom there in these areas, but there's a lot of bluegrass thatch to these spots. This is an area where, you don't have to necessarily start over. You could go in and drill in and install some seed to an area like this. Often when you do interseedings like this, you don't need as much seed because you're maybe just trying to put some forb seed in there. You don't necessarily need to put grass seed in with this. But I should note that, this still requires preparation. Even if I were to go and have seed drilled into these overgrown bluegrass areas, there's a lot of thatch there. Is that seed going to get enough sunlight in order to germinate? Is it going to be able to compete with this bluegrass? So even with interseeding projects, you still have to prepare that area. Maybe it's a mowing or burning off that thatch, whatever it is, you need to prepare that area so that that seed can get good soil contact and then get enough sunlight in order to germinate and compete. And there will too always be a need to carefully assess the existing conditions. So these are the type of areas that often already have some sort of persistent weed problem. At least that's what I've noticed in our parks. These are the areas that, because they've gone unmanaged, Canada thistle has shown up, often Canada goldenrod, which is native, but it's a very aggressive weedy native. That's one that can persist in areas like this and eventually outcompete anything that you're trying to seed in. You just want to make sure to go out and assess your existing conditions before you consider doing something like this to even ensure that what you're putting in can compete well with it. But it's not a hands-off site preparation free approach. Plant selection is kind of the next phase. So this is something that is going to vary depending on what your goals are. So when we talked about site selection, if you have a shadier, moister site, that's going to affect what your plant species selection or your seed mix selection is going to be. Or potentially it's a drier and a sunnier site that'll also influence what you're going to end up selecting for your installation. A lot of what plays into that is soil, so the texture and the drainage. And this is not necessarily something, I should preface this slide, that you need to be an expert on in order to do. If you're working with a reputable seed vendor, which I have a resource slide at the end that provides some suggestions, or you've got a contractor that's familiar with this type of work. They can guide you in the right direction based on your site with what you're going to need. You don't need to go out and do the soil testing yourselves to figure out what it is. There are a lot of resources out there for this. But things like soils are going to influence what you ultimately end up picking for your seed mix that goes in. Budget is another factor. You can get things like Agricol, for example, is a seed vendor we work with. You can get something called the Economy Prairie Mix, which is about $574 per acre. That has native forbs and grasses in it, but they're pretty, early successional, really aggressive prairie plant species. You're not going to have a lot of high diversity in there, versus the bird and butterfly seed mix. You have some more conservative or sensitive species, interesting species, much more diversity in there, and that's about just over $2,000 per acre. So there's quite a price difference. So your budget will affect what you can end up really putting into your installation and selecting for it. Bloom times is another consideration to make if you're designing a native planting. Most of these seed mixes include, if you buy them pre-made like this, they'll have a wide array of bloom times within the species that have been selected for those mixes. But if you're doing an installation where, say, you're planting native plugs or container size plants, I'll touch on that in a minute, you want to make sure that you're kind of picking an array of species that'll bloom. Some will bloom maybe May, June, then you have late summer bloomers. So that's something to consider, especially if you want to do this type of a planting for visual appeal and also for wildlife, because then you're providing a nectar source for pollinators throughout the year, not just at one point when everything's blooming at all in one time. The grass to forb ratio is also something to think about when you are selecting seed mixes or looking at a planting installation. You should be looking for something that has about 50 to 60% forbs by weight. Historically, seed mixes used to be pretty heavy on some of the grasses, big blue stem, Indian grass, and switchgrass, but you do want to pick something that's heavier on the forb side. A lot of those prairie grasses are pretty rhizomatic and aggressive, so it's important to have a good component of forbs in there, so you don't just get a warm season grass dominant stand in your prairie planting. You also want to consider pure live seed, and that's just an industry measure to tell you what quantity of seed, what percentage of it is going to germinate. So you want to buy seed from a reputable vendor that does have good PLS, and that will be something that they can talk through with you when you work through them, as well as climate, picking seed mixes that are appropriate to our region and the plant hardiness zones. I have that hyperlinked here, but basically we want to pick species that can handle our coldest days and also our driest and warmest stints of the growing season. So you don't want to pick something that's going to have a mix of species that are not adapted for our microclimate here. And I will reiterate at the end right here that consulting with a vendor, a seed vendor, they can point you in the right direction with what to select for your site, or if you're working with a contractor, they can help you determine what you're going to need and what's going to do best given the site elements that we discussed a little bit earlier. Planting time and technique. So we're kind of in a great window right now for doing native plantings, but the beauty with planting native plants is you kind of have a huge window here of opportunity to do plantings, and the technique will just vary depending on what time of year you're at. The main thing is we don't do planting in July and August. Those are the hotter, drier months, and also it's a little bit too late, so things will start to try to germinate, but then before they get enough growth to them, we'll be having some freeze thaw events, and that'll just kill things off. So that's usually the window within the growing season that is not recommended to do any form of native plantings. In early spring, some of the benefits to doing it in early spring is you do have rains that may make watering less critical, but you also have then the caveat to that is if you're doing it in early spring, you have a limited opportunity for, say, that early cool season weed control, that early season May application of glyphosate if you were, working on a turf grass conversion. So that's a consideration to make. Late spring's an option too. You have more time for that spring weed control prior to doing your seeding, like we had discussed. But you do start to run into June weather, which could mean low moisture conditions. Also, it could mean really rainy, wet year. We don't seem to know year to year these days in our region, but that's something that needs to be kept in mind if you're looking at a late spring window, that you may have to do some watering if drought conditions are looking to be evident. And then dormant seeding. This is something that we do a lot of in our parks. So that happens September through even right now. I say even right now as if it is freezing, but it's not. We're having some, we could use a good freeze. The dormant seedings obviously don't require watering. So we do also have the option to do, and this is something we do frequently, something called the snow seeding. So if we see a snow coming in over winter, we go out and we'll broadcast seed either by hand or with a seed spreader right before a snow comes through, and then that blankets that seed on the ground with a good layer of snow, kind of caps it off from some of the wildlife that might pick it off too in the winter. But a lot of the native seed that we have, it needs to go through a cold stratification. So those seeds need to go through a state of freezing before they're actually going to germinate. So doing a seeding dormant like this is great for that reason, because it'll go through that stratification process. And it's not going to require watering on your end if you're doing it during the dormant window as well. So now is a great time of year to be doing seedings, but you do have a large window between spring and then our dormant seeding windows as well. So some of the techniques that we use for installing native seed and doing these plantings. We do own a Truax native seed drill. So drilling seed is an option. This is most efficient for really large areas. So anything over an acre, we're usually utilizing our native seed drill. And what's great about the seed drill is it does get that seed planted down to the exact depth and an even rate across the site. Because if you say you're out broadcasting seed by hand, one of the things you have to be conscientious of is how much in the coverage, because you can put down too much seed per acre and those little seedlings will be competing with each other for those resources. So you never want to overseed with these native plantings for that reason. But the seed drill does a good job. It's calibrated to put out a certain amount of seed over the area that you're seeding and at that exact depth. So it's a fantastic tool to have for our larger areas that we've done. It requires clean seed. There's a lot of really narrow tubing that the seed goes down into. You can see one of those images there on the bottom right. We've got the wildflower seed broken up into different size packages, and then that big white bag is the grass seed. So that gets put in a separate container in the drill from the other smaller, finer seeds. But you can't just go out and collect seed with all the fluff and the chaff. If you think of like milkweed seed, right, that comes out of the pod, it's got a lot of that chaff or fluff. That can't just be put right into the drill. It's going to clog it up. So it needs clean seed, which takes time to do. These drills are expensive to purchase. They run from about 20 to 36 grand. So often that's not a budget friendly option for most entities. And you can contract this work out though, however. So there are a lot of reputable vendors in the area, contractors that do native planting installations, as well as the preparation work that you can work with. And each vendor varies, but around $150 to $200 per acre just for the installation portion of a seeding, not including the cost of the seed that you may purchase, but that's just an idea of a contractor rate. But if you want to get a prairie drill seeded in, there are options for contracting that kind of work out as well. The other techniques that can be used to get your native planting installed, broadcast seeding is an option. So that's something that we do this time of year. Often we do that right onto sites that have been cultivated or have bare soil. We'll also broadcast seed in areas if we burned it off, if we're able to burn off all that dead thatch and you have nice mineral soil there, we'll broadcast seed onto that. So that can be done by hand, which is usually most efficient for areas under an acre, or you can use it with a spreader. That's what we're doing in that bottom image there for larger areas that you have a nice open bare soil for. It can require a bit more seed, and it is unpredictable. You know, you are throwing that seed out, and over the course of winter, say if you're doing a dormant seeding, the idea is that freeze thaw throughout winter, that seed will settle into the right depth and then germinate the next year. But obviously when you're throwing seed out onto the open ground, you're going to have to deal with things like, you know, wildlife picking that off. And also it's just in general more unpredictable in terms of success rates than drilling that seed into the exact depth. Native plugs are also an option. So that middle picture there, that's actually my mom. She had converted an area of their lawn to a native planting there. So she killed off the turf grass, as you can see there, it's nice and yellow, and she's planting in native plugs. So those are small containerized plants. So this is great for really small spots. The plants mature, it's going to start growing really well right out of the gates for you. You plant them at about 12 inches spaced apart minimum. Watering is definitely required though on something like this. So your site would need to be accessible for watering, and you'd have to have the staffing resources planned to watering those plants once they go in the ground. And you can put in plants towards the dormant end of the window, towards the end of the year going into the dormant season. You can still plant plugs. But you still often have to do some level of watering to kind of get them started. Mulching also helps in sites like this, but we don't do much of plug installation unless it's smaller landscaping bed type situations. Another option that we've been using more versus native plugs has actually been native vegetated matting through Agricol. I'm not sure. I'd be surprised if there wasn't, but I'm not entirely sure if there are other vendors at this time that sell NVM. But this has been a really good tool for us. We've used this at several sites pictured here. On the right there we had an old trail that we were looking at basically closing off. So instead of seeding it, because if you look at that, it's a long, narrow one, a lot of edge, very little surface area. So this was an area where I was definitely concerned with weed competition, basically Canada goldenrods growing all around that. But what's great about the NVM is you can see on the left, it's basically a mat of plants that have been well established, grown into this matting. And you can see all the plant roots and rhizomes there. So it kind of creates a really good, it's not completely impenetrable. You still have to monitor it for weed problems, but it really is good at suppressing other things. And the matting itself and the plants within the matting do really, really well. And so you get very quick establishment. It's really showy, really quick when it's in flower. It does require watering right out of the gates. So we usually, I think it has to be watered at least daily for the first 5 to 7 days, and then at least an inch a week, 2 to 6 weeks after it's been installed. And again, that'll vary depending on the type of precipitation levels that you're getting within a growing season. But this has been a really super handy basically tool to have in the toolbox for areas that would normally take a lot of work to maintain if it was done by seed or by individual plugs. So here's another example of where we used NVM. This was at Foxbrook Park. It was a shoreline restoration, and this is a before and after shot. So we had the soil bags there to kind of reinforce the shoreline. We did put plugs into the soil bags, but then everything basically at the top there, that's all rolled out a year later, native vegetative matting that was put in. You do have to order at least a minimum number of rolls for the NVM. Agricole, again, is the vendor that we work with to obtain this. But what I have really come to like about this is, again, for those smaller areas or those areas that are long and linear or narrow, this stuff establishes really well, really quick. And we have sites where we have NVM that's 5 years old now, and the weed and invasive species issues are still something that we only have to worry about on the edges. It's really held out in terms of being impenetrable to other weed species towards the center. Not to say that wouldn't be an issue on some sites, but I have been very impressed with NVM as a tool. Maintenance. So this is probably, aside from site preparation, this is the other spot where we can all kind of things can go wrong for us. Right? So say we have budget to get a project done, the contractor comes in, and as part of this, parking lot, they also put in some native landscaping in the parking lot medians or around a building. And then when that project's done, the maintenance isn't roped into it. So that's on our staff to do. The maintenance is key in keeping these things from turning into total weed beds or failing. So maintenance is something, if you can rope it into your contracts, that's ideal. But if not, there's just, some key things here to know so that your staff that are charged with maintaining these areas can work it in their annual work plans. The beauty with native plantings, especially prairie plantings, they are species that evolve to do well in nutrient poor environments. So you do not need to be fertilizing these areas that you've seeded. Watering is limited, and it also just depends on the technique and the timing used. Again, if you did plugs or NVM, you're going to be likely doing some watering to help it get established. If you did a dormant seeding or even a seeding in early spring, you're not likely going to need to water that. Mowing is one of the most important things that you need to work into the maintenance plan, especially it's mainly for seeding. So if you've done either broadcast seeding or something's been drill seeded into an area that was once turf, you still need to mow it, especially in the first couple years. And the reason you're going to need to do that is because these native plants are not going to be the species that shoot up and grow in that first year typically. A lot of what you're going to see in that planting area are going to be the weedy annual species, and then eventually some biennials will probably try to pop up. But those native species are going to be putting a lot of resources into growing their roots, and top growth will be really minimal, so they'll be very small. So by mowing it regularly throughout the first and then again in the second year, if needed, you're essentially giving those native seedlings a chance to still have access to that sunlight so they're not getting smothered by other things. And also you're preventing some really hard competitors that they might have to work against in terms of things like Canada thistle or burdock you're working to suppress those by regularly mowing it during this establishment phase, we'll call it. So for the first year in an area that you've seeded to natives, you want to mow when the planting, generally speaking, reaches 12 feet down to about 6 inches. So a lot of those annuals will grow quick. And remember, a lot of those natives are still going to be pretty small. And even if you see some natives, like often in the first year in a planting, you might see some black-eyed Susans come up. Still get those mowings in because a lot of those species that are going to be the ones maintaining that planting that you're going to want to see growing and persisting for a long time, they're going to need you to be doing that mowing to reduce that thatch, and also to make sure that we're controlling biennial perennial weeds. So that usually lines up with a mowing in June, July, and August, we've found. And then in the second year, often we're really only mowing that stand if we have issues with biennial weeds that might be in flower. And I'll touch on what some of those biennial weeds are in a little bit. But in that year, you're just kind of bumping it up from mowing. Instead of at 12, it's when those biennial weeds are, about 24 inches, or when those weeds are in flower, you mow, and you mow it down to a foot, but you don't want to go lower than that because your natives may have a little bit more height to them. And that's often around mid-June that's done. And for smaller plantings too, this can be done with a string trimmer too. It's not, you don't need any large equipment in those small areas, obviously, but walk behind mowers will use our out fronts as well in areas like this for doing that type of mowing. But the mowing is really crucial for seedings when they're getting established in their first and second year, and it should not be missed. Beyond that, for a lot of these prairie plantings, depending on where you're working, and if you can do something like prescribed burning, after that establishment phase, there is still maintenance that will be needed. So I mentioned it earlier, but these prairie ecosystems are always working to succeed up into becoming forests. It's just natural succession is what happens. So to ensure that we maintain that prairie and we keep it vibrant and diverse, as well as limit the amount of woody encroachment, so woody brush that's growing up into it, working it into some sort of prescribed burn regimen, or even mowing. You can simulate burning by mowing in the spring or the fall. Ideally, you would get that thatch off. Again, the great thing about fire is that it basically burns off that thatch. So even if you're going to simulate that burn, you need to try to find a way to remove that thatch. Most of these plantings are ready by their third year for a prescribed burn. Even the NVM can be burned, and between I believe by the 5th year, that would be something I would check with the vendor on, but you can eventually burn the native vegetative matting. And you can contract this out too. So it's something, if you don't have the resources to do it in-house, that is something that can be contracted out. And then lastly, monitoring. So it's never a walk away situation. You want to make sure you're monitoring these plantings so that you're staying on top of the amount of maybe woody brush that's coming up, but also what invasives or what weeds are prevalent that need to be managed. And these are kind of, I call them the party crashers. So these are the ones that you often see show up in those native plantings that tend to cause some problems in terms of management. Canada thistle is a perennial weed. That's a big one. Spurge, crown vetch, sweet clover is a biennial. So is wild parsnip and teasel. These are just some examples here, but these are species that you will frequently see in these types of installations that you definitely want to be on top of controlling when they are seen. And that can be done with mowing, but also with chemical treatment as well, with spot treatments as well. The Southeastern Wisconsin Invasive Species Consortium is a really great resource in our area in terms of offering advice on and guidance on control techniques. That's also something that we do here at the county. So we've developed what we call a quick reference guide that includes all of the weeds and invasive species that we manage across the park system. It talks about the different methods you can use to eradicate them and control them. And when it comes to chemical, we also specify the type of chemical that can be used, the concentration that should be used to get the most effective control of a species. So this is a resource that I'm happy to share if you reach out to me. But between the Southeastern Wisconsin Invasive Species Consortium and your neighbors here with the county, we can definitely help provide guidance if you're having any issues with non-native species in your plantings or installations, or even as part of your preparation work to do a native installation. So as I wrap up here, just a couple examples of some more conversion areas that we've done in the parks in case you ever want to go take a look for yourself and see what some of this work looks like on the ground. So at Waukesha County Park, we've converted about 9 acres of turf grass total within the last couple years from turf to native plantings. One was at the park entrance, and we also had, that was that image there where we killed off the turf. That was then drill seeded with, I believe this one was just the economy prairie mix that we had drilled in. So this is pretty standard for what it looks like a couple years in, but now we regularly maintain that area with prescribed fire. The other area that we converted was we were having a kind of nuisance issue with the geese at our swimming pond. And so one thing that geese don't like is really long overgrown vegetation. So on one part of the pond where they tended to congregate, we decided to convert it from what was turf and portion of underutilized beach sand to native planting. And this was an area that we actually used the NVM, the native vegetative matting. So you can see we have our skid steer out there with the bucket, and we kind of just mimicked basically a sod cutter and removed that upper layer of sand, got down to mineral soil there, rolled out NVM, and that gets staked into the ground. We have some fencing up to keep the geese off of it. That was really important because initially they didn't put fencing up and the geese were in there just mowing it down. So getting some fencing up to protect it early on was important. But then again, this is, as I mentioned, with the rudbeckia, the first year, this is the flush that we got from the native vegetative matting. And now when you go back out there, we have a high diversity of purple prairie clover and lead plant, and there's cardinal flowers, and it's a very diverse mixture. And the weeding has been, as I mentioned, minimal, and it's all on the edges, of course, but it's nice that it hasn't managed to penetrate the center of the planting. And we even had a, towards the edge of the shoreline on some swamp thistle, endangered rusty patch bumblebees were found on a survey that were nectaring on some of the plants within the planting and nearby. So it was an added bonus to this project. Municipal Park over in the city of Waukesha, we've done quite a lot of turf grass, basically no mow areas. We've done 24 acres, taken 24 acres out of mowing. But this was one of those examples where we did interseeding. So we haven't killed off any turf or anything like that, but we did interseed to basically improve park aesthetics along Sunset Drive. So this is the right of way to the road there. We mowed down that turf grass, or excuse me, it was basically the Kentucky bluegrass had grown for about a year. And then they mowed it down and then drill seeded into that. But they were able, they had some form of haying equipment when they did this, and they were able to remove that thatch, which is key, getting the cut material off of the site before we're seeding it. So they did that, drill seeded, and now that whole right of way there is quite a lot more diverse with wildflowers during the growing season. But the goal there was to improve aesthetics and improve pollinator habitat, which this does meet those goals. We also, I wanted to mention the example at Fox River Park, because this was an example of where prairie wasn't necessarily the most appropriate type of turf grass conversion just based on the site. So you can see in the middle image, the larger image there, we have the big woodland at Fox River Park. It's a dry mesic forest. And then we had some areas of mowed grass leading up to our trail and then our park drive. Installing prairie in that area that appears kind of dead, it's like the yellowish grass between the trail and the woods, next to a woods, it didn't make sense ecologically and maintenance wise, because trees and everything would just be growing up in it the second we stopped mowing it. So instead of planting prairie here, this was an area where we identified to plant sapling trees and just create more buffer to that forest. So we took 15 acres out of the mowing program and then enhanced it by planting it with about 30 different species of trees and shrubs. So, you know, we kind of traded prairie for the forest here, but it increased forest buffer for wildlife at the park. We've got some really rare state threatened bird species that nest there that we actually get quite a few park users that come regularly just to see these birds, like the hooded warbler. But this was just a unique situation where it's not necessarily a native herbaceous plants, but we use native trees and shrubs to convert an area from turf grass into a native natural state. And the benefit we haven't really touched on much at all, but I'll just mention here is there are a lot of community engagement benefits to doing this kind of work too. It's a great education piece. So for signage, there's a lot of our rain gardens and prairie installations that have educational signage next to them talking about some of not just the operational benefits to the park system, but the environmental benefits that areas like that provide. Citizen science, that rusty patched bumblebee that I mentioned, that was documented by one of our volunteers that was trained to go survey for bumblebees. And with that kind of data, it makes you eligible for some really interesting grant opportunities if you can prove that this habitat we're providing is supporting endangered species. It's definitely better leverage for getting funding to maybe do more of that work or help assistance with maintaining the work you are doing. And then stewardship, we engage volunteers to help with doing invasive control in a lot of these plantings too, in these planting beds. So our volunteers get trained to learn how to identify some of those biennial and perennial weeds. And it's a great project for school groups or even just families to come in and adopt a planting bed basically and help maintain it so that it can grow and thrive. And then last but not least here is kind of a resource page that I wanted to provide. As I mentioned at the start, this was extremely high level. So I would encourage you to follow up with me or any other local practitioners or vendors with some of these questions. If you're thinking about doing this, there's so much information and experience out there on this topic. So lean on your neighbors, lean on your friends and ask questions. We're here to help. So call Retzer if you want to talk to me. Otherwise, you can look up and see. CWISC actually has a list of reputable vendors that do things like native planting installation. They do invasive species control. So I can provide you with that, or you could go to CWISC's website, Southeastern Wisconsin Invasive Species Consortium, and look that up and they can provide that to you. As well as some grant opportunities towards the bottom. So there are a lot of grant opportunities out there for doing work like this because of the environmental benefits that they do provide. So I will, if you can't screenshot this now, I know Joanna will make sure to share that kind of information out. But again, feel free to, as I mentioned, reach out to me by email with any questions, or even if you're in the area and you have a site that you're considering doing this on and you just want some pointers. We can meet out in the field and do that too, but we're happy to be a resource here and point you in the right direction if we can't be of assistance in the field. But thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Julia. There was so much information and it was really just fascinating. I know there's a lot of questions in the chat. And this was a lunch and learn. So if you do need to sign off now, we will include the Q&A in the recording that I send out, so you can always come back and watch it. But Julia, if you have a few minutes to stick around and answer some questions, we would super appreciate it. Yep.
So okay. The couple of questions that we have in the chat here is, Julia, how do you keep track or estimate the fuel reduction for converting turf grass? I'm imagining that this is a budget question as well.
Yeah, so historically what they would do, each of our park units and every piece of equipment has kind of a pro key, a key that's associated with it. So anytime it would get filled up, that would be tracked by that particular meter at the park. So they pulled those estimates basically on an annual basis and just averaged the change at that facility. So at Minooka Park, and again, there's variability depending on the unit they're using, as well as if it's a really wet year and a sunny year and grass is growing really quickly, they're mowing more frequently. But the short of it is that we had a tracking mechanism for each unit where we can see how often and how much fuel that particular unit used within a year at that park. And then they just track the changes and, okay, we're not, X amount of fuel, less gallons was used in the ZTR, which is used for out front turf mowing every year. So that's how they pulled those numbers. And we just pulled that together for each of the facilities to get to that end number, basically.
Okay. What's the public's perception or feedback that you've been getting in terms of using large herbicide applications? Go ahead.
It's not been bad. I think it depends. So I worked in Milwaukee County for quite some time before coming here, and I will say that there was a bit of a difference, just I think depending on just people's familiarity with those practices. So we used to get a lot of pushback when I was doing that type of work in Milwaukee County, and I think out here in Waukesha. I don't know if it's because the county's been doing a lot of that work for quite some time, that the communities were just a bit more familiar with seeing that type of work done. But ultimately what we do anytime we're doing a large scale application of herbicide, obviously it's always posted as is required by the label and law. But we do additional kind of PR on the front end. So we will put out a park alert, we'll put out an FAQ, kind of just telling the public what's going on here and why, and how the chemical application is a really crucial part of that process of getting to that end goal ultimately. So I think in addition to just making sure you're doing everything by the label, doing additional outreach and education with park users or the community in advance always helps just answer some of those questions that people might have out of the get-go. Because, you know, we even post at the sites when that turf grass is browned off and dead after it's been sprayed, we laminate and put the FAQ right out at some of those sites, because we know we're going to get questions. They want to know why the grass is dead, and then it's a concerning thing like, I didn't know this was sprayed, or why. So doing additional PR and marketing, I think, definitely helps.
So have you considered using lower grass seed fractions, like as low as 10% grasses in order to increase the number of forbs and diversity?
Can. Yeah, and you can have custom mixes designed for that purpose. For the most part, we kind of stick with the mixes that are available. We haven't custom designed much, but if it's a small area, or if you're doing an interseeding, which we have done, we'll actually use forb seed that we've collected and cleaned ourselves, versus doing any grasses in those areas, because we just want to promote forb cover. You can go that low, especially if the grasses in that mix are one of those big three that I mentioned. If it's big blue stem, Indian grass, or switchgrass, you really don't need to go super high with that in areas like this. Again, it just depends on what your end goal kind of is for that particular site.
So there's a question here. Do you rent the native seed drill?
Not at this time. That is something that I recently was actually looking into, because I know there's other county entities in Wisconsin I saw that have Truex drills and rent it out. We don't at this time. We'll make sure to share if we eventually do end up doing that. But I think at the end of the day, if I had to offer any advice, I think what we would end up, if we could go back, probably just work with the contractor. If you know you want to drill seed in, it's, I think, economically more feasible just to work with a contractor to get seed installed if you're going to drill it, but not at this time, maybe in the future.
Okay. Do you have an estimated cost per square foot for using the NVM?
Give me so I had a landscape architect message me. Are we good if I stop screen sharing really quick?
Yes.
Okay, because I had asked for a recent update on that cost. So $44 per square yard. That does not include delivery.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
And then we've got one more, and that is for prescribed burning. Do you always utilize contractors, or to what degree do you use house staff to do the burns?
Good question. Our burns are predominantly in-house. So myself, I'm one of the county burn bosses. So we have a crew of 12 that we do all of our burns in-house. There are some more complex burns that we have contracted out for, but for the most part, we do ours in-house. But there are several vendors in the area that you can contract out to. The county does mainly in-house.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Julia. This has been a great presentation. We really appreciate your time today.
Of course. Of course. Thank you for having me.
Yes. So again, thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who came today. Once again, I will be sending out this video recording along with the resources that Julia mentioned. And we encourage you all to attend some of the Saltwise presentations that are happening in January. And if you have any suggestions, ideas, or if you yourself are an expert in something for future training, I would love to hear from you. Or if you are a municipality who is interested in potentially partnering with the Waukesha County Green Team on any type of program, presentation, or work, please also reach out to me. My contact information and Deborah's as well will be in the follow-up email. So with that, thank you so much, Julia. We wish you all a really great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks all.